Ethan Harper had always been the quiet observer in every room he entered. He wasn't shy in the traditional sense, but he preferred to measure people first, to understand them before committing to the kind of familiarity that most considered friendship. His 23 years had been punctuated by routine, early morning jogs, late-night online conversations, and weekends spent in the muted company of his thoughts. He liked it that way, predictable yet safe. But tonight, as he lounged on his apartment balcony watching the city lights blur under the faint drizzle, there was an itch of anticipation he couldn't quite name. The invitation had come unexpectedly. His maternal uncle, Ryan Harper, had asked him to drop by a small family gathering. Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors and close friends. Ethan almost declined, citing an early morning the next day, but something in Ryan's tone made him pause, a warmth, an insistence that made saying no impossible. He had always admired his uncle for that balance, firm yet encouraging, cautious yet willing to push boundaries when it mattered. When he arrived at Ryan's townhouse, laughter spilled from the living room, warm and inviting. Ethan's eyes immediately caught a new face among the familiar ones. Caleb Morgan stood near the fireplace, his posture casual but commanding, an effortless charm radiating in the way he tilted his head as he listened to someone speak. Ethan felt a jolt of awareness, an uncomfortable but electric recognition that this person, this friend of his uncle's, was somehow different from everyone else. Caleb noticed Ethan almost immediately, offering a brief, polite smile that lingered just a fraction too long for it to feel ordinary. There was a spark of something unspoken in his gaze, subtle yet undeniable. It made Ethan acutely aware of the rest of the room fading into a blur, his focus narrowing to this one presence. He felt a strange mix of curiosity and hesitation, an internal tug-of-war he couldn't quite rationalize. Ryan, ever perceptive, guided Ethan toward Caleb. "Ethan, this is Caleb. Caleb, meet my nephew, Ethan." The handshake was firm, measured, and lingered just long enough to make Ethan aware of the warmth of Caleb's hand, the understated confidence in the grip. Caleb's voice, when he spoke, was smooth, friendly, and slightly teasing, as if he already knew something private that Ethan had yet to discover about himself. The conversation started lightly, weather, recent neighborhood events, Ryan's usual anecdotes, but there was an undercurrent, subtle and hypnotic. Caleb asked questions that seemed casual but struck deeper than their surface. He noticed Ethan's choice of words, the slight hesitation before he answered, and responded in kind, weaving humor and curiosity in a way that made Ethan feel both seen and slightly vulnerable. It was unsettling in the best possible way. By the time dessert arrived, Ethan found himself sitting closer to Caleb than the situation technically required. He laughed more freely than he had expected, and each glance exchanged seemed to carry more weight than the words spoken. There was no overt flirtation, nothing inappropriate for a family gathering, yet the energy between them hummed with a tension Ethan hadn't anticipated. He caught himself wondering, briefly, almost shamefully, what it would feel like to have this person as his own friend, beyond the confines of familial connection. Caleb excused himself for a moment, and Ethan watched as he moved through the room, effortless and poised, interacting with others in a way that drew them in yet never overwhelmed. There was a quiet magnetism to him, a sense that he lived comfortably on the boundary between charm and enigma. Ethan's mind replayed the first handshake, the subtle nuances of tone, the ease with which Caleb seemed to read him. He realized that he wanted to know Caleb in a way that went beyond casual acquaintance, an admission that both thrilled and terrified him. After the gathering began to wind down, Ryan clapped Ethan lightly on the shoulder. "Don't be shy, kid. Caleb's heading to a coffee shop nearby tomorrow afternoon. Why don't you drop by? You two might get along." The suggestion was casual, almost offhand, but Ethan felt a pulse of excitement he hadn't expected. He nodded, trying to mask the flutter in his chest, and mumbled something noncommittal. Inside, however, a plan was already forming. Back in his apartment, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Caleb. He replayed the moments of conversation, the way Caleb had laughed at his jokes, the intensity behind certain glances. His fingers itched for a phone, for a message to bridge the gap between fleeting acquaintance and potential friendship. And so, he sent a brief, cautious text, a simple, friendly greeting that hinted at curiosity without revealing too much. Caleb responded almost instantly. "Hey, Ethan. Great meeting you tonight. Coffee sounds good, how about tomorrow afternoon?" The efficiency of the reply, combined with the subtle warmth behind it, made Ethan grin despite himself. He typed back a time, paused, deleted, and retyped. He felt a thrill, a pulse of anticipation that made him hyper-aware of the empty apartment around him, the muted hum of the city, and the soft glow of streetlights through the window. Lying on his bed later, Ethan reflected on the evening. There was something about Caleb that made the world feel simultaneously larger and smaller, larger in the possibilities of connection, smaller in the way everything else seemed to fade into the background when he thought of him. It was unnerving and exhilarating, the kind of feeling that came rarely and demanded attention. By the time he drifted off to sleep, Ethan had made an unspoken decision. He would pursue this friendship, carefully, cautiously, but pursue it nonetheless. The spark was there, undeniable, and he couldn't ignore it without betraying a part of himself that had been dormant for far too long. What this path would bring, clarity, chaos, or something in between, he could not yet know. But one thing was certain, his life had just shifted in a way that promised to change everything, and somewhere in the city, Caleb Morgan probably didn't know how much influence he had already begun to wield over Ethan Harper's thoughts, or how the simple act of a smile and a conversation could set the stage for a story neither of them had yet imagined. Ethan woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest that he hadn't expected. The memory of his visit to Lucas's house lingered like a subtle fragrance, pleasant, unsettling, impossible to ignore. As he moved through the quiet of his apartment, the sunlight slanting through the blinds caught dust motes in a way that made the room feel simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. His thoughts circled Lucas, the intensity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the effortless way he seemed to understand truths that Ethan had spent years hiding from himself. Grace called later, her voice cheerful over the phone. "Breakfast at my place?" she asked. Ethan agreed, though he felt an odd dissonance between the familiarity of her invitation and the turbulence inside him. At breakfast, Grace noticed his distraction. "You've been quiet," she said, setting down her coffee. "Something on your mind?" Ethan forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just tired, I guess," he said. But he knew the explanation was thin. Thoughts of Lucas, the subtle tension, the connection, the moral complexity, occupied more space than he cared to admit. The day passed slowly. Messages from Lucas arrived intermittently, short and casual. "Hope your day is going well," one read. Ethan hesitated before replying, conscious of the delicate balance he was navigating between curiosity and propriety. He responded briefly, avoiding the temptation to dwell on the subtext of their interaction. Each notification felt like a pulse, reminding him that the story was not yet complete. Later in the week, Lucas unexpectedly appeared at Grace's house. Ethan's heart skipped, caught off guard by the presence that had already taken on more significance than he expected. Lucas greeted him with a nod, an acknowledgement that carried layers of meaning without words. Grace, unaware of the unspoken dynamics, chatted animatedly about her week, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Michael, who listened silently as always. Ethan noticed the subtle exchanges, glances, pauses in conversation, a hand lightly brushing the edge of a chair, that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. He realized that this was not about physical attraction, at least not in the conventional sense. It was about recognition, being seen in a way that required neither explanation nor justification. He felt a mixture of exhilaration and guilt, a complex cocktail of emotions that left him simultaneously energized and burdened. During lunch, Lucas leaned in slightly while discussing mundane topics, and Ethan caught himself absorbing every word, every inflection. The conversation drifted toward personal histories, family expectations, and the choices that define us. Lucas spoke candidly about his own struggles, the ways he had had to conceal aspects of himself, and the quiet courage it required to live authentically. Ethan listened, recognizing reflections of his own internal conflicts. "You know," Lucas said softly, "sometimes the hardest part isn't discovering who you are, it's accepting it. Accepting it without fear, without shame." His words lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, striking chords within Ethan that he hadn't realized were still tender. Ethan felt compelled to respond, to articulate the truth he had kept locked away. Yet he paused, weighing the consequences, the familial ties, the delicate morality of the situation. In that pause, he realized something crucial: this wasn't about temptation or betrayal. It was about reflection, acknowledgement, and understanding. After the lunch concluded, Lucas stayed behind for a moment to speak privately. "Ethan," he said, his tone gentle, "you don't have to respond in any particular way. Just know that honesty, with yourself first, matters more than any expectation." The words were simple, but their weight was immense. Ethan nodded, feeling the quiet gravity of the moment, recognizing that this exchange was a turning point, a subtle but profound shift in his consciousness. As Lucas left, the air in the house seemed to settle differently. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and tension, a sense that something important had occurred without dramatic action or overt confession. He understood that this was not the conclusion of the story but the beginning of an inner journey, one that would require reflection, courage, and perhaps even confrontation with truths he had long ignored. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his room, replaying the events of the week. He thought about Grace, about Michael, about the unspoken rules of family and society. He also thought about Lucas, about the rare clarity and acknowledgement he had received, the mirror held up to his own suppressed identity. The realization was profound: connections do not always need to manifest in grand gestures. Sometimes, a quiet understanding, a shared glance, or a single sentence can redefine perspectives, priorities, and desires. Ethan wrote in his journal, carefully choosing words that allowed him to explore emotions without judgment. He reflected on guilt, curiosity, and authenticity, recognizing the necessity of separating impulse from insight. The visit to Lucas's home, the conversations, the subtle tension, all had been catalysts for something greater, a confrontation with the self, with truths that had long been buried beneath routine, expectation, and fear. In the days that followed, Ethan and Lucas maintained a cautious distance, their interactions brief but meaningful. Each message, each meeting, each conversation carried layers of significance, building a quiet narrative of understanding rather than action. Ethan discovered that the value of these moments lay not in what was done, but in what was recognized, acknowledged, and held in confidence. By the end of the week, Ethan realized he had changed in subtle yet undeniable ways. He was more attuned to his emotions, more aware of the boundaries between desire and morality, connection and complication. He had learned that human relationships are rarely simple, that honesty with oneself is a form of courage, and that understanding does not always require action. It can exist quietly, shaping decisions, thoughts, and future paths. As he prepared for another weekend visit to Grace's house, Ethan felt a sense of calm tempered by anticipation. He knew that the story with Lucas was not a tale of dramatic conflict or overt scandal. Instead, it was a story of recognition, self-reflection, and the delicate dance of morality and human connection. It ended not with resolution, but with clarity, a bittersweet acceptance of complexity. Ethan understood one final truth: life rarely offers answers in neat packages. Some of the most profound experiences are those that leave questions lingering, allowing reflection, growth, and understanding to flourish quietly in their wake. And in that quiet space, he felt both awakened and prepared, for whatever challenges, connections, or revelations might lie ahead. The following weeks unfolded quietly, as if the apartment itself held its breath. What had once felt like polite distance between Lucas and me began to soften into something warmer, something unspoken but persistent. The morning silences at the coffee maker turned into conversations that lingered too long. He'd ask about my day before it even began, and I found myself wanting to answer. We developed a rhythm that felt natural, too natural. He cooked dinner most nights, and I cleaned up afterward. Sometimes he'd stay in the kitchen with me, leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, voice low and unhurried. He'd tell small stories about his past, a childhood in Oregon, a brother he hadn't spoken to in years, a dream of one day owning a small cafe by the coast. His stories carried a melancholy that mirrored my own. One night, as I dried the last plate, I asked without thinking, "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" He smiled faintly, eyes focused on the dark window. "You stop noticing after a while," he said. Then, after a pause, "Until someone reminds you what company feels like." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. But something in his tone lingered, circling my thoughts long after I went to bed. Lucas had a way of filling the space between words with emotion. A brush of his hand, a glance across the room, each one carried more meaning than entire conversations. I told myself it was friendship, the kind of fragile connection two lonely people build to survive. But each day made the lie harder to maintain. It was late one evening when he mentioned Dylan. We were on the balcony, a bottle of red wine between us, the city lights flickering below. "I haven't been completely honest," he said, tracing the rim of his glass with a finger. The air grew still. "I'm still seeing someone. His name's Dylan. We've been together for years, but he travels a lot for work. Things have been complicated." I felt the ground shift under me. "Complicated how?" I asked, though part of me already knew that he sighed. "He's gone most of the time. When he's here, it feels like we're strangers sharing the same house. I guess I didn't realize how lonely I was until you moved in." I looked at him, heart thudding. His confession wasn't shocking, it only confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, but hearing it aloud made it real. It changed the way the air felt between us. "I'm not trying to make things messy," he added quickly, reading the hesitation on my face. "I just needed to tell you." The silence that followed was heavy and alive. I could hear the faint hum of traffic below, the whisper of wind against glass. I wanted to leave, to end the moment before it became something irreversible. But I stayed. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the closing of his door. My mind replayed his words again and again, each repetition threading guilt through the quiet longing I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I told myself to keep my distance. But distance is a fragile thing when you share walls and mornings. Days later, it was the heater that started it. My room's old radiator broke in the middle of an unusually cold night. I tried to fix it, but the metal hissed and rattled uselessly. Lucas knocked on my door, hair messy from sleep. "You'll freeze in here," he said. "Come stay in my room until it's fixed." I hesitated. "That's not necessary." "It's fine, Ethan," he said softly. "I'll take the couch if it makes you more comfortable." But when I stepped into his room, it was clear he hadn't meant it. The bed was wide enough for two, and the couch barely large enough for one. I told myself it was temporary, just one night that we lay there, a careful space between us, the glow from the streetlight cutting through the blinds. Neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and my own heart, too loud in the quiet. Then, faintly, he whispered, "Do you ever wish things were simpler?" I turned my head. He was looking at me, eyes open in the dark. "Sometimes," I said. "But simple doesn't always mean right." He smiled sadly. "No. It doesn't." The space between us dissolved. His hand found mine under the blanket, hesitant at first, then sure. I didn't pull away. The touch felt inevitable, like gravity, slow, certain, unstoppable. When his lips met mine, the world shrank to the quiet pulse of breath and heartbeat. It wasn't rushed, not desperate, just two people stepping across a line they'd been pretending not to see. For a moment, everything felt right in the wrong way. Later, I lay awake, watching the faint light spill across his face. He looked peaceful, younger somehow. But guilt crept in, cold and certain. I had promised myself I wouldn't become part of someone else's betrayal, yet here I was, tracing the same painful outline. At dawn, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The apartment was hushed, the kind of stillness that follows after something irreversible. I made coffee, hands trembling slightly, and stared out the window as the sky turned pale. When Lucas entered the kitchen, he didn't speak. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what we both already knew. His touch was warm, but it burned with consequence that he finally said, "Dylan's coming back this weekend." I froze. The words landed heavy. "Does he know?" I asked that. He shook his head. "No. And I don't know what to do." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The coffee steamed between us, untouched. "I shouldn't have," I began, but he cut me off gently. "Don't," he said. "Last night was real. Even if it was wrong." I wanted to believe him, but the truth pressed hard against my chest. Real didn't make it right. The rest of the day passed like a half-remembered dream. I went through the motions, work, chores, quiet meals, but the air between us had changed. Every look, every word carried the weight of something forbidden. That night, as Lucas slept beside me again, I stared at the ceiling. I could feel the warmth of him, close enough to touch, close enough to destroy. That I told myself I could stop it here, that this would be the last night, the last secret. But as his hand brushed mine in sleep, the lie settled heavy and familiar in my chest. That I turned toward him, watching the faint rhythm of his breath. He looked calm, content. I envied that peace that I whispered to the dark. I told myself it was love. The words barely left my lips before the truth followed, silent but undeniable. That it already felt like a secret.